Hello everyone, I'm Beatly Tone from Beatly Tone's Beatles channel, and you're watching Two Legs, the #1 Paul McCartney podcast on YouTube, co-hosted by the Fab Two, Andy Nichols and Tom Hunyadi. Enjoy.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to another installment of Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast. I am one of your two co-hosts, Andy Nichols, and we do a show just about every week on the solo career of Paul McCartney. And joining me today is the co-founder and co-creator of Two Legs, Mr. Tom Hunyadi. Good afternoon, Tom.
Good afternoon, Andy. It's great to be back doing another episode with our buddy Owen here. Is always a treasure, always a treat. To have this young lad on the show, and
Finally,
and this is part three,
Part three of which the much talked about finally got around to scheduling it on a day off that worked for all of our calendars. Paul and George Part 3. Joining us today is none other than Mr. Eoghan Lyng. Owen is such a distinguished author and scholar, and his work has been featured in Record Collector, where he did a lovely contribution on the album New. He has written for Culture Sonar. He recently interviewed Hugh Padgham for Blitzed magazine, and he is also the author of George Harrison in the 70s, which came out in 2022. Eoghan Lyng, happy to have you back on Two Legs, brother. How are things?
Yeah. So when you talk about this guy, I'm like, have I met him? Who is this guy that you're talking about? He seems a lot more impressive than me.
Well, it's it comes with sincere praise, because your contributions and your work over across the years have been highly enjoyable to read, and they benefit the Beatles community as a whole because of the work that you do and the people that you've interviewed and the people that you've written for. So we are better educated culturally as a society because of what you do for us. So thank you.
Oh, come on. But thank you.
Of course, of course.
It's very
So, Owen, so this is part 3 of this. We first did our first installment of this show back in July of 2023, which was part 1. Mm-hmm. Then we went to part 2 in earlier this year, January 2024. And now finally we're going to do the part 3, and this is going to cover the years 1982 through 1988. If you see the banner below that Owen pointed at the start of the show, or the little QR code up near Tom's shoulder, that is our kind of QR code and website for Buy Me a Coffee, which if you want to support the show, you can with any amount that you feel necessary. You don't have to. We've already got a couple since we've launched this. Oh my God. Thank you guys to those who donated and supported us. You don't have to. It's just a little bit of a way to help us along the show, as we have hosting sites and subscriptions that we have to pay for to kind of do this and continue this show and keep it the way we want to keep it going. We've tried some YouTube stuff. We know that some frenetic YouTubers kind of make money on that. We tried that route. It didn't work. So now we're doing, we've signed up with buymeacoffee.com, and it seems to work. So thank you for those who have donated and supported to us. Thank you.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
So this is part 3 of this. We first did our first installment of this show back in July of 2023, which was part 1. Mm-hmm. Then we went to part 2 in earlier this year, January 2024. And now finally we're going to do the part 3, and this is going to cover the years 1982 through 1988, tackling this kind of friendly rivalry and some really caustic comments between Paul and George throughout the 1980s. And my partner in crime there, Tom, compiled a nice timeline that we're going to kind of follow throughout the show today. And Tom, but just before we kind of dive into it, why don't you just kind of show everybody some of the books, the great books that you've used to reference these timelines and put a timeline together for this period.
Yeah, so I mean, this has been a lot of fun, reading these books that I've had now. I mean, some thanks to you, some thanks to other people, but one is the George Harrison on George Harrison, with edited by Ashley Kahn. This has been a great source of information. Obviously, we can't go without our buddy Doggett's book, You Never Give Me Your Money. Fantastic. If you haven't read this, this is bar none in the top 5 of greatest Beatles related books ever written. And then Andy, thanks to you, this book right here, The Beatles, after the breakup, 1970 to 2000, thanks to Keith Badman, compiled. And what this is really, it's just, what they were doing, socially, media-wise, day by day, whether they did radio interviews, press interviews, magazine interviews, were they talking about each other, everything that intertweaved during the solo years from 70 to 2000. Great source of material right here. And this is where I got the bulk of the information right here. So
that's a great book. Owen, out of those books, have you used any of them in your research or read them at all?
Well, the Ashley Can book was invaluable for my book. That was the big one, and of course Doggett. I mean, Doggett's such a beautiful writer. I mean, such a vivid piece of work. I mean, how could you resist? It might be the best written book, the Peter Doggett book of all Beatles. He's a phenomenal writer.
He really is. He really is. And I'm glad that we have that timeline to work with today. Before we go into the topic, Owen, there's been a bevy of activity since you've been on. Give us your take on the state of all things Beatles and solo here in October of 2024. We've had Underdubbed, we've had One Hand Clapping, we've got the announcement of Material World, the 60th anniversary of the mono albums, touring again, Mind Games in the summer. Give us your take on all that. What have been some highlights? What have you thought is kind of not so great? The last since you've been on earlier this year. Give us your take on the state of the Beatles and solo in 2024.
Well, I think One Hand Clapping was something of a masterpiece. I gave it 5 stars in my review for Dirty Movies, which is a magazine I write for. I actually went to Cannes with Victor from Dirty Movies this year, which was a thrill. Thanks. So that was a big one. The Mind Games remaster, it really showed what the album was about. I think it was a vast. Well, I don't think it's. I compared it on Twitter to Blood on the Tracks, which I think is what Lennon was trying to go for with that album, with this kind of revelation and exploration of his failed marriage, which I think it's closer. I think the production. I think the biggest failing with that album is that Lennon produced it himself, where he would have been better off with a bona fide producer, I think.
For the first time producing an album by himself. And it's been no shy of activity, obviously, now on the tour. Starting up again, the Got Back tour, which is, by the time this is now dropped, is well underway. And do you have any intentions of seeing any of the shows of this go-around in Europe?
Me? If I can get to Manchester, I'd like to go to it, if I can get to Manchester, but... we'll see. He's not playing in Dublin. Well, sadly, I know it's a shame. I've been in contact with Brian Ray. If I can interview him, I'd love to, because I reviewed his album for Eighth Day magazine. Besides that, Brian, if you're watching, Brian, I'm not putting you under pressure. That's just me talking out loud.
Well, speaking of interviews, you just did a great interview with Hugh Padgham. Talk about that for a minute.
Oh, stop it. Okay, well, that was during the summer. Hugh Padgham. To my surprise, he read some of my work, which was he said that he'd read a piece I'd written about Phil Collins and said flattering stuff like, I think you probably know more about this era than I do. It's in Blitzed magazine. I don't know if you guys can get that in the US. To my surprise, I saw it in Dublin, which surprised me because I thought it was only available in England. But I'm sure you can get it online. I'll put in the link to the mag in the box. But yeah, Hugh Padgham, he was very generous with his answers, very insightful. I sent it to Ken Michaels, and he's a good interview, but I would have liked more press-to-play material.
Of course. Obviously, it featured him more on the Phil and Genesis stuff, which as a fellow progger, I was totally okay with that, with having you talk and have Hugh dish on, everything that was done with those 3 albums he produced, basically. Did he engineer Abacab, but then he produced everything else after that, right?
He effectively co-produced Abacab. He was always a technical, in that he produced them. I mean, Banks and Rutherford called the shots.
Right.
He was the one who made them sound really good. I mean, he said that himself several times in interviews, and that he said he would have preferred if they kept it a bit proggier, because a lot of people blame him for going pop, which is ludicrous.
Oh, you can blame Banks and Rutherford for that solely. Would you agree?
Yeah. And I don't see what's so bad about changing direction anyway. I mean, if stuff like Illegal Alien is that, okay, you can hang your head in shame for Illegal Alien. But I mean, The Invisible Touch is a lovely song. In Too Deep's a lovely song. Home by the Sea is a fantastic song. I mean, and they
I beg to differ. I mean, being at that that first MTV generation, I finally remember that Illegal Alien video,
Which
I thought
couldn't get away with that now.
Yeah, exactly. But I thought it was a fun song. Is it their best? Absolutely not. But I have fond memories of that song.
Absolutely, and it's such a wonder that you were able to get Hugh, because obviously he crosses worlds between people like Phil and Genesis and Paul McCartney. So, and some people are just, they're not into Genesis. They want to just hear, somebody like Ken Michaels wants to hear dish on, press to play. Did you find him reticent to kind of really dive in on Paul McCartney, or just a little bit? Like, how did you find him talking about his time with McCartney?
Well, the main thing was, initially when I pitched it, I wanted to focus on Synchronicity, which had just been re-released, and that's the main reason why. Fair. So it's mostly about Synchronicity and the Police, and some things about Genesis. I've no doubt he would have been happy enough to talk about Press to Play in further detail. But the only thing he was a little bit cagey about was he says Eric Stewart has a very different memory to how I remember it, and that's his diplomatic English way of saying I think So for transparency, I told him, you do know I've interviewed Eric Stewart. He said, yeah, I know all that. He said, yeah, and Eric has said a lot of stuff that I don't agree with.
Okay, so I'm sure you handled that as diplomatically as you could, because obviously you've interviewed Eric Stewart. You are a very well-schooled person, knowledge and connoisseur of everything Eric Stewart and 10cc. So I'm not surprised. You knew that he knew that you did your homework.
Well, thank you. Well, my interview with Eric Stewart might be the interview I'm best known for. So I think it was read out on Nothing Is Real. I think Sam read it out on Press to Play. It's been read out in a few places, quoted in a few places. So I think if I'm known for an interview, it's that one with Eric Stewart. So if I can be that immodest.
Yeah, well, I think the Hugh Padgham one is just as important. I do. I mean, I know Eric Stewart is obvious, but having Hugh Padgham, that's a score. I mean, I know what's Hugh Padgham up to these days, and anything.
So he was calling me from Greece, and he was while I was in like the rain in Ireland, he was showing off his suntan in Greece. So he's set up a record label. If I put it in the piece that he's more behind the scenes encouraging people. I don't think he's quite as hands on as he used to be. He seems to be in the background, and he's semi-retired, I believe. I think he's happy enough that he's happy enough to look back fondly on his time in the 1980s. I mean, what a pedigree! The Police, Genesis, the Face Value album, which is a fantastic album. Yeah. Face Value alone is like an A+.
Okay, so the topic at hand, the 80s, the relationship between Paul and George, and how things really were a little bit frosty. If you had to define their relationship throughout this period, Owen, how would you?
Brotherly. They're happy to meet up at weddings and that sort of thing, but there's no chance they're working together. No chance.
No. And do you think that Paul felt a little twinge of jealousy with the success of Cloud 9, and especially with When We Was Fab? Do you think that really kind of goaded Macca a little bit with that success that George had commercially with that record?
Perhaps. I mean, there's a great interview with Terry Wogan, and he says, I like the younger bands, U2, George Harrison, and Terry Wogan says, you're both doing very well for yourselves. You're both doing terrific work. I said, yeah, we should work together.
Exactly. So we kick off the 80s. We have a get-together really with the MPL film, The Cooler, which was a bonus kind of film that accompanied Stop and Smell the Roses, was entered in a Best Short Subject competition at Cannes Film Festival when Ringo and George attended it. The Cooler. I can't say I've seen it a whole lot of times. Owen, your thoughts on The Cooler?
It is what it is. Godley and Cream directed it, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
Right. Yep. Yes, they did.
Yeah. I listened to Nothing Is Real, and Kevin Godley himself was surprised that it entered Cannes because it's cheap.
It is very, and you'd
Yeah.
think. I mean, Stop and Smell the Roses has been repackaged about 3 times in the last year on vinyl, on CD, on colored vinyl, and in all these repackaging, we actually have not gotten a bonus disc of the Cooler included in any of these sets, which you would think it should accompany this album because
Well,
outside of
yeah, I
you
mean,
know,
it's
Go ahead.
an MPL. MPL owns it, so they would the people that are distributing the album would have to license it. That costs
True.
money. Um, maybe they just don't feel it's worth it.
maybe not.
Maybe.
As it sits in the vaults. 1984, okay, in April of 84, Paul and Ringo officially announced that they will both accept Liverpool's Freedom of the City Award. George remains non-committal. This was kind of Paul 84, obviously, is Broad Street, and he did get the key to the city later that year. So, again, this is kind of another example of kind of just the two of them going this way, and Paul has now become Liverpool's favorite son. I don't think George is not. It's just this was an event that they just didn't feel like he needed to attend. So
You just don't. You don't. In a lot of interviews, you just don't hear him talking much about Liverpool and going back much and just spending time there. Really.
no, I mean,
So
it was a hard life. And his mom and dad, his mom died in 1970. He made some trips back to visit her, but none of them really. I mean, Ringo and George especially, their upbringings were not they were kind of rough. So you can't blame them for not wanting to go back and embrace it. Unlike Paul certainly has. Any thoughts on that, Owen? Just on that whole Beatle connection to Liverpool post success.
I think it's just personalities, how they are. I think Paul was the one most relaxed around Liverpool of the 4 Beatles. I mean, George Harrison despised secondary school. He had memories of being smackings and just as a natural rebel, he didn't like teachers kowtowing, giving homework, etc., etc. And also, like, if as you say, like he visits his mother dying from cancer, that must have soured a bit his adult experiences. And I believe
Right.
his father moved away, maybe to London or something. So what was the point of going back once his father didn't live there anymore?
Exactly. And he had moved on. His father moved in with him, and I believe lived in Friar Park towards the end of his life. Obviously, if you look at the gatefold sleeve of 33 and a third, you can see the elder Mr. Harrison. So, I mean, the connection to Liverpool, I don't blame George for that. Clearly, Macca is their favorite son, and he embraces it. So it's no surprising there. Also in '84. No. On the New York rock station WNEW 102.7, Paul was commenting on George's reluctance to do interviews. Paul says he really doesn't like to do interviews. I mean, sometimes it could be a pressure, you want to be playing out in the park and you've got to sit and do an interview. And George was always a little bit more forthright than the rest of us. And he'd just say, I don't want to do it, which is a good song. So I think George's thing, it's not a crazy thing. In truth, I think he's just actually has got disenchanted with the whole idea. And I know why. Because he has to fight to get radio play with some of his stuff. And he thinks, well, the hell with it, why am I bothering? And I know a certain time he just got fed up with the whole thing. So I suppose that's why you're getting your answers. He's just not the kind of crazy reclusive who lives in some place and guards himself up from the world. He's got a lot of friends amongst all those friends he gets about and stuff. He likes gardening. And I think more than anything, you can't help it. If that's what his bag is, you got to allow him. You can't say, okay, George, listen, you're a musician. You shall not garden. You got to let him do what he wants.
I love that.
You got to let him do what he wants. He's a big boy now. So that's a complimentary comment from Paul. Thoughts on that?
It is. It is. It's a really good interview. This is on. You can get this on YouTube. It's fantastic. And yeah, and he's just being cordial. And I mean, I don't know if George really wanted Paul, to hear Paul spill the beans of why he doesn't want to do interviews or whatever. But I mean, it's done in a nice way. It's not like he doesn't want to do interviews because this and that. So he was being quite nice about it. So it's a good interview.
Yeah.
Or I should say, it's a good quote from Paul.
It's again friendly. He's just being honest, okay. And as we get through the rest of the '80s, things kind of change a little bit, okay. February of '85, George, Ringo and Yoko file an $8.6 million lawsuit against Paul for breach of contract. They allege that Paul is earning, quote, preferential royalty from Beatles records to the others as an incentive for him to re-sign with Capitol as a solo artist, end quote. Lawyers on behalf of Paul are quick to point out that, Quote, although that fact is true, Capitol didn't decrease royalty payments to John, George, and Ringo. Owen, what say you about this? Is the McCartney Clause. What say you?
Well, I would direct you guys did a fantastic interview with Peter Doggett, and I think viewers should go back to that interview.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
This was a big, in the Doggett book. This was a big deal to read about this happening, and this is really kind of what stems the tide really for the rest of the '80s in my opinion, between Paul and George, and you see it kind of continue to sour there towards the end of the '80s into the early '90s. Tom.
Yeah, no, it's definitely thanks to Capital for re-signing Paul, we get this and kind of the extra little incentive for this, but obviously we know what this leads to, and we're going to be talking about it in 1988. But it's unfortunate that it takes a while. It took a while for this to finally get settled.
It did. Moving into July of '85, of course, Live Aid, where Macca plays, and George was offered to play. Here we have Bob Geldof reaching out to play with Paul, and George, quote, said, "I was away at the time. I got back to England the day before, or 2 days before the concert. When I arrived at Heathrow, the press said, 'Are you doing the concert, George?' And I said, 'I don't know anything about it.' Then I read something in the paper saying the Beatles are getting back together. There were a few phone calls. I think Geldof phoned my office and asked if I would like to sing Let It Be with Paul. But that was literally the day before the concert, and I don't know. Well, I was jet-lagged for a start. I saw they had everybody in the world on this concert, and I didn't see it would make much difference if I wasn't. So, another opportunity gone astray."
Yeah, I mean, well, go ahead, Owen.
Well, not really. I mean, there's no way George Harrison's going to sing harmony vocal on a Paul McCartney track. That's just not going to happen.
Right.
No,
Right. Right. I mean, look. I mean, he's kind of right though. But look, I mean, it gets Led Zeppelin back together, right? It gets Black Sabbath back together with Ozzy. There's all. I mean, every act on the world except for George and Ringo are there. So
isn't that the gig, Owen? Isn't that the gig, Owen, that Robert Plant said he couldn't stand the way Phil Collins drummed for Led Zeppelin during that performance? Is that right?
It's not Robert Plant because he's very good pals with Phil Collins. I think it was Jimmy Page who said that.
Jimmy Page did not like the drumming. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, but I thought Phil was fine. That was when Phil ruled the world in 1985, and he could do no wrong. I don't think his drumming was that bad during Led Zeppelin's performance. What do you think?
Well, I think what happened was he just flew in, and I think Stairway to Heaven was just sprung on him there and then. So he has that story of he does the drums for and Jimmy's like, no. But I mean, if you look at Jimmy Page during that performance, he's not well. He's out of it. I mean, he's practically drooling over the guitar. He's playing out of tune.
Right.
He is, and I know we touched on your interview with Padgham, and Phil Collins and Paul McCartney have done a lot of big things together, tribute concerts, jubilees and that. But that's one collaboration that would have been really cool if the two of them got together in the '80s when Phil was at his zenith and they really worked on something. And I wonder if that opportunity ever was broached or discussed. What do you guys think about that possibly happening? I mean, it's fascinating to think. It's almost like that Gabriel kind of thing that almost didn't happen, but that one song they wrote that never came about it. But a Collins and McCartney collaboration at the height of Phil would have been fantastic right around this time.
Probably. Well, they did Angry together. I mean, that's him on drums.
Right.
He's appeared on a few records, and again, you can watch him drum to the Golden Slumbers at the concert for Montserrat. I mean, a few times, but it's just they're so unique. They're so unique and talented. To see two of them together, just for the album or a couple of singles, would have been interesting. I wonder if Phil's popularity would have helped Paul's 1980s image a bit. Who knows?
Well, but like Owen said, I mean, he is on Angry, and I think that was a common thing. I mean,
yeah, but who knows Angry outside of us? Nobody, right. no common Beatle fan knows that song.
Right.
True. We're moving towards 1986, The Prince's Trust, which we talk about. Paul's there, and George and Ringo are also there. The following year, George and Ringo perform.
Right.
So obviously that sparks a little interest in playing. Obviously, Paul's was, I always felt, sparked the interest to play. George and Ringo got together, and I think they did While My Guitar Gently Weeps at that performance. Tom?
Yeah, they definitely did that one. I mean, I remember watching these so much as a kid. I think it was A&E. I can't remember what network televised them here in the States.
Yep.
But yeah, I remember seeing, both of those shows. I remember A&E replaying them, often. So I did get to see those quite a few times. But yeah, I mean, Paul, as we said, I think you've said it a couple times, Andy, where you think this might have been one of the shows that kind of sparked him to wanting to, play live. I mean, obviously we know the issue he had at Live Aid, right, with the mic going out. But this one seemed like a lot of fun. He was with a lot of great people, doing duetting with Tina Turner, with Get Back, being on the stage with so many great musicians. That definitely had to be some kind of spark for him.
Oh, and did you see any of this concert footage like at the time? Did you see this in real time, or you were too young?
Born. I wasn't even born. I wasn't even born in '86.
Old soul that you are. I love it.
I'm only 31. And anyway, Tom, you called me a punk kid when you interviewed Darrell Easley. I'm 31.
Oh, you're just a baby. You're just a baby. But yeah, obviously you've seen the Prince's Trust stuff. I mean, they're obviously pretty visible here. 86, 87. Whose performances did you like? Which one did you like better? The Paul one or the one with George and Ringo? Which performance did you like better?
I actually think the version of Get Back you did with Tina is better than the Beatles original. Boom.
There's
another hot take.
There's
from
those
our friend
Eoghan Lyng
Owen.
hot takes, baby. Like, keep them coming, baby. The man knows how to generate discussions. I'll give you that. He really does. I'm telling you,
I did enjoy. Yeah, I did enjoy. I mean, it was cool seeing George and Ringo. I mean, obviously, at that time, I didn't know how much they did all that stuff prior to this event, but it was cool to see them on stage and playing together as a young Beatles fan. This was like heaven for me,
And it's a big deal. I mean, to see two Beatles on television performing, we take it for granted now in a constantly connected world of videos and performances. It's a big deal for Paul to see Paul on stage, to see George and Ringo on stage in the 80s was a big deal.
And I wonder if George and Ringo do it if Paul didn't do it the year before.
I don't know. Probably, I would say no. They saw Paul do it, and they said, "Okay, we can do it too." Moving ahead the timeline, Paul and George are publicly thanked by the Cystic Fibrosis Research Trust for their kindness and generosity in making donations to bring closer the scientific breakthrough needed in the fight against the disease. Very nice, Paul and George. 87. This is where things heat up a little bit in 87 and 88. October of 87, George and Ringo visit Paul in Cavendish to discuss plans for the long-forgotten Long and Winding Road project, which was started by Neil Aspinall, which eventually became the Beatles Anthology, but we were years away from any of that happening. Also, on the 2nd of November of 87, a journalist asks George about the persistent rumors that Paul and Ringo were going to play on the album. He replies, quote, "Yeah, the only person who wasn't going to be on it was George." Ouch. So, a little bit of a stinging comment.
I mean, listen, the 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, there's a lot of great sound bites from George Harrison, regarding, Paul, and even John to an extent too, because, they do, he does get asked, by one reporter about, how John's feelings about, what he wrote about I Me Mine or what he didn't write about I Me Mine.
Yeah.
And he has some great sound bites about John as well. So, George, ever the great,
you never knew what mood he was going to be in. He could be silly and funny, or then he could just say,
Right.
you know what, like, it's like that line, I guess Paul needs another hit, so we're going to talk about the Beatles,
Right.
something, whatever, along those lines, So,
Right.
George was always going to give you his take on how he was feeling at the time, much like John would do.
Yeah.
Okay, 19th of November of 87. This is All the Best Time. Paul is on Terry Wogan's show to promote All the Best.
Right.
Paul mentions he's number 2 on the album charts, and George is number 2 on the singles charts with Got My Mind Set on You. I'm telling you, he'll never admit it, but that success of George definitely got Macca itching. He'll never admit it, but I believe it did. Thursday, the 3rd of December of 87, in an interview for French television, Paul discusses the possibility of working with George in 1988. Paul is also asked about George's HandMade Films company. Quote, George has been the surprise, I think, because when we did the movies, probably the least one interested was George. He'd turn up, he'd play, he didn't really want to know. He was serious, he didn't like the movies. He thought it was a bit stupid, acting, I just want to play my guitar. But he's turned out to be the most successful in movies. They've just made Mona Lisa and made some really good films. They've made some bad ones too. Ha ha ha. Shanghai Surprise was one of them, but he made some really, really good ones. So now George kind of going to HandMade Films. Owen, your take on HandMade and George's career with them?
Well, as you say, they made some great films. Like Mona Lisa is a classic of British cinema. Long Good Friday is a fantastic film. Life of Brian is a fantastic film. With Neil and I has become something of a cult classic in Ireland and the UK. But then again, they also produced Shanghai Surprise, which makes, give my regards to Broad Street, look like a credible film. It is genuinely appalling, Shanghai Surprise. It should have been binned. I think if it wasn't for the fact that Madonna and Sean Penn were in it, it would have been binned and unreleased.
You got into my life. I don't know how you found me, but you didn't stop me heading someplace else. Took me a while to say, wish you belonged to me, but now I'm saddened as I've never been, regretting that we leave. So for a while, could you comfort me, hold me for some time? I need you now to be beside me, while all my world is so untidy.
With that particular song, there's a scene where I think where she gets in the taxi and he bangs his head on the taxi and he says something about, what do you think it'd be like if we'd have met someplace else? So I thought, that sounds like a good song title.
I hope you won't let go. Maybe you let me know that you'll be saddened like you'll never be, regretting that we'll leave. And for a while I could comfort you or hold you for some time. I need you now to be beside me, while all my world is sad and crazy. Loneliness, empty faces, wish I could leave them all in someplace else.
Where would you classify Time Bandits in that timeline, and or your opinion of it?
I think it's a very good film. I prefer other Gillian films like Munchausen or Brazil. Brazil is a superb film. But Time Bandits, it's quite fun. It's whimsical. It's reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland. It's got that wonderful shock ending where the parents die. Whoops, spoilers.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Return the map. I adore Time Bandits.
I gotta say, my favorite handmade film, though, hands down, is Nuns on the Run, which was in the early '90s with Robbie Coltrane and Eric Idle. That is a brilliant, funny film. Have you seen it?
Yes, that was the last handmade film under George's supervision.
Oh, that movie is a riot. Tom, have you seen that movie?
I have not seen Nuns on the Run. I will seek it out and check it out.
Okay, trivia time. Owen, what George Harrison song is featured in the film Nuns on the Run? For 10 bonus points. Go.
Run of the Mill?
No. Strike one. Think
I
now.
have no idea.
Have a guess here. I'll late 70s George. Late 70s George.
Blow away. Blow away.
Bingo. Blow away.
Yeah.
Blow Away is featured in Nuns on the Run. So it just briefly somewhere in the beginning of the film, but that's a funny movie. But you guys would definitely go check that one out, Thomas.
Yes, we'll do.
So the handmade stuff.
But I mean,
go ahead.
But no, but I'm just saying. But yeah, I mean, it is probably because of the Monty Pythons that he does enter the or enters feet first or head first, however you want to say it, into the film world. And like Owen said, I mean, he produced some fantastic films, and he's credited into bringing English cinema into the '80s. Fantastic stuff. He had a really good successful run there. With like Long Good Friday, Mona Lisa, how to, our with Nell and I, Time Bandits. So they're great stuff. Some really good
But
stuff.
you see, obviously, George's foray into films ends up being kind of his financial downfall there with his manager, right, Owen, with Dennis O'Brien a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not qualified to say why it went down, but yes, they ended up. I mean, there was a long legal court battle that really only ended just weeks before he died.
Yeah, and
Did it go? It went on that long, Owen? Wow.
Yeah, it's in the Peter Doggett book that it was so bittersweet that he finally won something just weeks before he died.
And when you think about this, was basically his manager who was involved with Handmade too, basically bankrupting and just kind of from George and stealing from George, and which really is why George accepts and agrees to do the Beatles Anthology project because he needed to.
Yeah, I think I was. Yeah, I was just going to say that too. I mean, going back to when they're all visiting Paul at his home and talking about maybe revisiting this. Maybe if George doesn't run into this issue, maybe we don't get Beatles Anthology, or maybe it's completely different than how it turned out.
Because I think George only agreed to it. I'm from what I've read and everything that I've studied, George only agreed to it because of the Handmade Films and his manager disaster, and which is unfortunate. But out of a really horrible situation, we got a wonderful project, a sanitized Beatles version project. But we got it. I just hate that it had to have at the expense of George's career and his livelihood to have somebody just screw him over like that.
Yeah, but we all do stuff for money, and I personally think George would have gotten involved some way, but really it was the financial value that got everyone involved. There's a great bit in the Peter Doggett book where George Martin has no interest until someone tells him how much the recordings are worth, and suddenly it's a treasure vault.
Right. Ending out 1987 on the 12th of December on a television program, George states,
Well, I liked him very much. He was a groove. He was a good lad, but at the same time, he misread me. He didn't realize who I was. And this was one of the main faults of John and Paul. They were so busy being John and Paul, they failed to realize who else was around at the time.
That's a big one.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, that was the trade-off, that Lennon helped him with Taxman, so he helped him with She Said, She Said. That's where it ends, right there and then.
But isn't it something, though, that where John gets cheesed off that he's not mentioned in the book, and I have no reason to dispute why, George wouldn't be lying that he contributed to these songs, because George doesn't really give a shit. Like, okay, yeah, I helped you out with the line of Eoghan Lyng Rigby, but I'm not going to get my panties in a bunch over it. But that's just, I find George to be telling the truth in that statement. Do you?
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think maybe it was at a time when Lennon was feeling vulnerable. The Double Fantasy album didn't do that brilliantly, and it wasn't selling the bucket loads that everyone thought until he died, and then suddenly became like the #1 album. But maybe it was a bit of insecurity on his part. Maybe it was a bit of fearfulness. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. John was always super sensitive too, right? Because here comes little George pushing it out. His own book, his own biography, which at that time really only Lennon had ever done was Spaniard in the Works in his own right. So now George is going to write his own autobiography, and there's no mention of John. Well, come on, John, stop being so insecure. He's always looked at as the forever younger guy. That whole, he didn't realize who I was, it was pretty telling for 1987. One of the more comments that leave you a little stinging from George with Paul and John, really, at that time. And that leads us into 1988, because now the legal stuff is just, as we mentioned, that happened in 86, is now really played out. The Beatles are finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with a horrible introduction by Mike Love of the Beach Boys.
I don't have to say much because I'm the quiet Beatle. It is unfortunate Paul's not here because he was the one who had the speech in his pocket.
And why didn't they play Octopus's Garden?
We'll talk about that later. Anyway, we all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all loved Paul very much.
That time, Paul also released a statement. After 20 years, the Beatles still have some business differences, which I hope would have been settled by now. Unfortunately, they haven't been, so I'd feel like a complete hypocrite waving and smiling at them at the fake reunion. Tom, brother, we have talked about this. You just bite the bullet and you wave, right? You just do the right thing and you just wave.
You just bite the bullet and wave. I think this should be one of Paul's big regrets in his life. And if it isn't, then fine too. But you know what? You show up. You show up. You say thank you, and you go on your merry way.
Oh yeah, no, I'm with you guys. I mean, it's a bit stupid. I mean, he turns up to his one happily. Yeah, it's good to be. I just wish my baby was here. And doing all that. Of course, he had just lost Linda, so okay, we maybe shouldn't take the mick out of that. But he was happy to turn up to his one, but doesn't turn up to the Beatles one. I mean,
yeah,
it's honestly, it's when you watch that video. And George, he also finishes it off saying it's hard standing up here representing the Beatles, but it's all that's left, I'm afraid. And he goes, well,
right.
We all love Paul so much, and we all love John so much, and you've got George and Ringo, Yoko and Julian and Sean. Yoko throws a little zinger at him saying, John would be here if he could be. And this is like really, right. I think the apex of the disconnect between all the parties was around this time. And it's sad. It's sad really more than anything. I don't even like watching it.
I think Paul deserved that zinger from Yoko.
No, it's well-deserved zinger, and I think John would have probably given one back too, because if John found out that Paul was receiving a little bit more in royalties to re-sign with Capitol, I think he would have been pissed as well. I mean, look, he was pissed when he found out that Paul was buying more stock in Northern Songs, back in the late '60s.
69, yeah.
Yeah. So. I'm pretty pissed. Maybe
I would be, but something tells me if John was still around, Paul would not have done that move, because by that time John, I think, would have been savvy enough. I don't see it.
I disagree. He still does that move. I mean, you got to figure. Paul's probably still bitter about the whole Brian Epstein thing. The whole Alan Klein thing. He's probably pissed off that his money's put on hold for so many years because of all of the lawsuits and whatnot. So here's his way to feel like he's getting back what he deserves, I feel.
You do realize he signed this deal in the 70s during John Lennon's lifetime,
right?
Yes.
So
he did.
Yeah. So it was done in front. It was just the way Paul did it. They didn't tell the other three that he'd done this. That was a bit underhanded.
But he didn't have to. I mean, like the statement said, I mean, their payments didn't change one way or the other. Their payment didn't go down, or their share. So I feel like he didn't have to tell them. Should he have? Yeah, probably. But
it's sticky. I do like to think that Paul maybe takes some solace in the fact that in John Lennon's lifetime, he did admit that the Alan Klein thing was wrong, and that famous interview where he just says, let's say Paul was possibly right. And Paul has to take some satisfaction and realize, you know what, before John left this earth, he knew that was the wrong decision. And I think with age, Paul maybe comes to peace with it. I know as Owen says, he signed that contract in John's lifetime, and maybe if John is around in the 80s and that happens, I mean, John would clearly be up there too saying, what are you doing, Paul? And who knows where things would have gone. But I would like to think at some point things would have came back together at all.
One thing I'd also add about George is that when everyone was slamming the "Give My Regards to Broad Street" film, he actually said he enjoyed it, which I think says some credit for him. Where he's still standing by Paul, he just says, I just
Yeah,
told him not to do everything."
yeah, I mean, I remember that too, and I was trying to find the interview where he was saying that he did enjoy it, but then he also was like telling Paul, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing everything. Maybe you shouldn't, be the writer or the person in charge, the producer, and all this stuff. Maybe you shouldn't be taking on all these responsibilities.
Yeah, I do remember seeing that quote. I also remember reading a quote somewhere that George he liked the ballroom dancing bit. He liked that scene.
Yeah.
A little bit after the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, George makes an appearance on the call-in show Rockline, which was out of KLOS. And in that interview, George reveals that the part of the Walrus was played by Paul in Magical Mystery Tour. You mean
Fab.
When we was Fab?
When we was Fab, yeah. When we was Fab, yeah.
Paul wasn't in the costume. Paul admitted that he wasn't in the costume. It was a joke.
I didn't think Paul. I didn't think Paul
Yeah.
was the Walrus. I think Paul. You see a kind of grayed out figure holding the Imagine album cover. I think that's Paul.
Right.
He's not in the video.
The microscopes that magnified the tears studied once and I'm still alive.
I think this is George just taking the Mickey out of everyone. I think he does admit that him and Jeff Lynne were drinking prior to this interview.
Oh God.
He does come off pretty shoddy in this interview, as in kind of pissed.
He was pissed. He was a little pissed.
Yeah, he was in a drunk sense of the word. But go ahead,
There's also a rumor that Paul Simon's in that video, so I brought it up with co-director Lol Cream, and Lol said, "Paul Simon? I've never even met him."
Sorry, you would know because Cream directed it. So Paul McCartney is not in When We Was Fab at all, right?
Right.
He's not. It was a joke. It was a joke because he's in the Walrus costume. George jokingly said, "Oh, that we put Paul in the costume," and McCartney denied it very quickly.
Yeah, and obviously, given the events of, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was just a month before. The video goes, everything Cloud 9 is a year before. There's no way Paul and George are going to get together and he's going to hop into his video with Jeff Lynne and Elton John and everybody else. It's just not going to happen. So it's a nice sentiment. I secretly kind of always wished, in my dreams that was Paul, but that was just my little fantasy in my head. I just know it.
Plus,
but we've got our last kind of entry here for 1988, which is on the 28th of March. George gives a press conference in Toronto. He is asked about Paul's recent comment that he would like to write some songs with George. Quote, "Yes, Paul has suggested that maybe, that he and me should write something again. It's pretty funny, really. I've only been here about 30 years in Paul's life, and now he wants to write with me? But maybe it would be quite interesting to do that. There's a thing with Paul. One minute he says one thing, and he's really charming, and the next minute he's all uptight. We all go through that, good and bad stuff, but by now, we've got to find the center." Funny quote there. Funny quote.
Yeah. This is a good one as well, and I can see why George would say something like this. I've always been here. Well, they did write. What was the song they wrote early on in the early days?
In spite of all the danger.
Yes, yeah.
Oh.
So right. So there's that, but yeah. But you would have thought that maybe they could have tried, but maybe they didn't. We just don't know.
No, I don't think so.
No, not at all. And then the same day, George appears on the Much Music Live interview hosted by Chris Ward. Ward asks George, "How do you feel when you heard McCartney's versions of the old songs on Broad Street?" George, "I think they were okay. I didn't notice they were new versions. I only watched it once. I remember Ballroom Dancing, but I don't remember the old ones." Ward, he said that he wanted to tackle some of the other old ones, including possibly some of John's songs like Beautiful Boy and Imagine. Does that surprise you, George? Paul? Ward? Yeah, George, maybe, because he ran out of good ones of his own. Well, Ward says, "Well, we've got that on record, George," and George ends it with, "Well, it's true." So Caustic George ending it with saying, he ran out of good ones on his own. So this is this, seesaw relationship that kind of took its more downs in the 80s than ups. I think we can all agree.
Yes.
With this one, this is like the big one that I wanted to make sure got into this episode because, um, in a way, uh, George maybe would take that back if he lived because as we know back in 2000 he does redo All Things Must Pass. So maybe it would feel different, but we also know how Paul felt about Beautiful Boy, right? As seeing him on the Desert Island Disc, we know how passionate he was about that song, and I'm sure he wished that he wrote that song.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that kind of takes it through the end of the 80s. Their relationship in the 1990s obviously gets a little more warmer, obviously with the anthology, with George wanting to do it financially because he needed to. But that'll be interesting to tackle because I think we can definitely do a part 4, which will take us to the end of George's life, right? I mean, pretty much. A good part of 93 and 94 is spent on, well, actually, I think even filming for the anthology goes back to as early as 1992 in some of those interviews. Some of those scenes of the Threedles together are enjoyable. Some of them are a little bit uncomfortable. They're sitting down in the park and strumming along to Dara Dune and things like that. It's nice, but there is some weird tension in those Threedle scenes, and they're doing Thinking of Linking. Right. And George is just like, really? You're going to play Thinking of Linking right now, Paul? Come on.
And then in the constant thick of things, during this whole time, we see that where George is, and we see where Paul is. Where Paul is always kind of taken, like with John after they settle their war of words in the press. Like Paul's always kind of like taking the high road, even though George might get in a quick, little jab here and there. Paul is always the one taking, the high road, and doesn't really. Maybe he learned his lesson from dealing with John in the press in the early 70s, but you don't really see him, like giving a jab back at George at any point in time.
But you do hear stories of him making jazz behind the scenes. Like there's a story during Anthology where George says, I wonder what people think of my demos. And Paul says, I wouldn't be too sure about that. That's a bit...
Well, yeah, but again, that's face to face, right? That's not in the press, though.
No, and I think that's around the same time. This is when George says, "Oh, I wish people took my crap demos and made them into hit songs after I'm dead." Isn't that the same time he says that quote?
That's that quote. That's actually what it is. And then Paul says, "Wouldn't be too sure about that."
Right. So, yeah, I mean, definitely we can wrap it up with a part 4 for the end of their life. And obviously, in fitting fashion, at the end of George's life, I mean, and we actually touched upon this in our episode on Driving Rain and why it's kind of forgotten. It comes out in November of 2001, which is the same month we lose George at the end of the month. And obviously, there's that famous quote, there's that famous clip of Paul coming out of the gate, and the press is there, and he's like, "Can I help you?" And some words on your passing, and that all kind of ends that ends it really. A year later, you've got Brainwashed released and the Concert for George, which kind of really ties a bow on the whole thing and a loving, fitting tribute with that ending that relationship on a peaceful note. Really, with Paul playing All Things Must Pass, which honestly is really just that's the icing on the cake because it's when I watch that concert, I'm like, he's gonna play this song. Like, of all the songs you're going to play All Things Must Pass. So I think that's a really nice way to close out this.
Yeah, and I had thought that originally too. Like the first, dozen times maybe I watched Concert for George, I'm thinking he's really doing all things. After you think about it, I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense that Paul does All Things Must Pass. In a way,
Owen?
If it was Concert for Paul and the other way around, it would be nice if George did a version of Maybe I'm Amazed, like acknowledging their finest ballad.
Interesting. So I never thought of it that way. That's a good spin on it. If you actually flipped it, would George be doing a song like Maybe I'm Amazed? Probably. I remember being just totally wow. Like, I cannot believe this is the song. All these kind of war of words that they've had over the decades. And at the end of the day, they loved each other, right? And brothers fight and quarrel, and there's good times and bad times, and they could go years without speaking, but at the end of the day, the love that they both had for each other was evident. Olivia can confirm that, and Paul does too. And that's the nature of being so close to somebody from literally teenage years, okay? You're going to have years of ups and downs and years of not speaking, and at the end of the day, they could bury the hatchet. And sadly, we lost George at 58, way too young. And that was a fitting way for his friend from way back when, from, riding the bus to school, to just pay tribute to him. And I think you couldn't have done it any better way, classier way than that concert. And God, we could do a whole episode just on that, Owen. And how many people that are not with us anymore from that concert, sadly.
Yes,
wow, yeah.
That's going to wrap up the 80s kind of relationship between Paul and George. We will definitely have Owen back to wrap it up with the 90s and the end of George's life, and a little bit of on Brainwashed, obviously. Owen, what are you currently working on and up to these days? And because you're always doing something.
Well, that's very kind. I'm actually, after this, I'm going straight to a gig to review a gig for Record Collector.
Okay.
Oh,
Excellent.
cool.
Excellent. Record Collector, which is a great magazine. Again, if you have not gotten that Macca issue, order it. It is one of the best magazines on Macca you can get. Yeah. Comprehensive, an entry for every album on here. And here we go, right here. A section on new, written by Eoghan Lyng, which he has gone on record saying it's one of Macca's best albums. And I agree with him. I wish you did more. I wish you reviewed more albums in here, but you did a lovely feature on new. And this is still available. You have to probably buy it online, though, as it only is available in the UK. But, I mean, one of the most comprehensive discographies and a great assembly of talented writers, of which Owen is one of them, edited and put together by our friend Daryl Easley, who put this issue together. So stay tuned and look out for the Record Collector.
Daryl did a phenomenal job.
Yeah, he did. Fantastic.
We loved having him on. Favorite track, gun to your head.
He did.
Favorite track on new. What's your favorite track on new?
On my way to work. I said this on the show I did with Ken Michaels and Darrell Easley. I think it's better than early days. It has a similar sentiment, but it's not as bitter.
Yeah, hard to believe that album is 11 years old already, and the fact that, and you'll like this, that Paul really keeps 2 songs from this in either his sound check or his set list with New and Queenie Eye, which is pretty amazing for an 11-year-old record.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And even Save Us was in there as a show opener for a good while too, through I want to say 2016 or 2017. So kudos to New, because outside of the Wings albums, how many 11-year-old albums are getting a song or two featured in the set list still? New does.
Well, it's a very good album. It's one of the best of the 21st century for McCartney.
Totally agree. Tom, what is the Talk More Talk gang up to?
Well, we just did an episode on the one-hand clapping. We all enjoyed our experience seeing that movie in the theater. I believe we are going to next, unless someone passes or we have to pay tribute to someone. I don't know, but or we get an announcement of something. We're probably going to talk about the Mind Games book next. So I need to start digging into this sucker and just absorbing it, taking it all in, and that's probably going to be our next episode, is reviewing the Mind Games book that just came out.
Have you
so
had?
Check that out. Go to the
Go ahead, Tom.
Go to the YouTube channel, Talk More Talk, a Solo Beatles videocast, and please subscribe. We're getting really close to 2,000 subscribers, and we really appreciate everybody checking it out.
Owen, before we sign off, the Mind Games literature, the book that Tom just held up, which was published by Thames and Hudson, which I got as part of the Cube, but also is the book. Have you had a chance to read any of the Mind Games literature and some of the contributions from some of the key players like Gordon Edwards and things like that since it came out?
I've skimmed it, but not properly.
Yeah, it's really it's an incredible dive into the take on the musicians in there. The book that Tom's holding up in particular is a nice book, but it's not so much about the album, because it's a lot of what happened the year before. Feminism and all the things that John and Yoko went to. There's not a lot about Mind Games per se to fill a book. So you've got a lot of activities from the year before. Obviously, the immigration stuff, feminism stuff, the Newtopia stuff. So, and there's a fantastic layout and spread of the Dakota. There's some promotional pieces in there, but it's tough to really put Mind Games as a book without kind of combining what the social activities that John and Yoko were up to the year prior, which was my kind of takeaway from those books. Would you agree?
I agree with you. Yeah. Let's go with that.
But I'm saying, there's so much involved with the year prior that it makes you wonder that if when we do get a Sometime in New York City box set, is there going to be more to? I'm sure there'll be more to add to a book, but I mean, how much of this stuff is going to get rehashed into a Sometime in New York City book then? If if and when we get that.
And when? Well, that's the big question.
Yeah.
If and when, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
Right.
As for me, Andy's Music Vault, the other leg, I've got a recent video on the ELO concert that I did with some friends a few weeks ago, which was fantastic.
Yes.
Jeff Lynne, Over and Out, which my co-host is going to be seeing. By the time this drops,
6 days.
He'll have seen Jeff Lynne and ELO say goodbye. So that was a good. Check that out on my own channel. For that, two legs. This is our first episode of the month of October. We'll have two more for you before the end of the month, and our usual live stuff and given any breaking news. As the Got Back tour rolls on, as of this date on October 12th, Paul has gigs in Sao Paulo, Cordoba, and Florianopolis, and then Lima, Bogota, and all those South American countries, and Mexico City in November before the UK and Paris in UK in December. So watch this space for more reactions, any set list changes, although we don't think there'll be too many, but watch our channel for that. So for Eoghan Lyng, Tom Hunyadi, I'm Andy Nichols signing off for episode 261. We'll see you next week here on Two Legs. Be well, everybody. Have a great day.
Listening to Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast, hosted by Tom Hunyadi and Andy Nichols, with musical contributions by Dylan